Welcome, everybody, to Release the Minions.
I like the evil laugh, was really
Thank
good.
you. And you get the evil laugh because it's Sunday.
That is the rule for Sunday.
True.
In fact, can you guys all give us an evil laugh? Would you give us an evil laugh? Yeah, that's the evil laugh I need for Sunday. That's great. Thank you so much.
You are the real heroes. So this is going to be a talk, this is going to be a panel on introducing role-playing games to youth, and I'm going to introduce the panelists. You'll notice up on the screen right now we have our Twitter handles, at Game to Grow and at Ethan Schoonover, and we'll talk a little bit more about personal handles later on. In fact, on this slide.
Right here.
So Adam, why don't we start with you?
Sure. My name's Adam Davis. I'm one of the executive directors of Game to Grow. You may have seen me on some other panels this weekend. This is my sixth panel, I think, so I'm a little bit paneled out. I might repeat myself if you've been to previous panels. I have a master's in education with a specialization in drama therapy. I've been running Game to Grow groups for about 8 years, and we run therapeutic social skills groups with kids. So we see almost 40 kids a week. A lot of our players, our youngest is 8 and our oldest is in his 20s, and we play the game very intentionally. We teach a lot of new players, so we have a lot of experience introducing the game to brand new players and then really modifying it for the specific needs of our kids.
My name is Adam Johns. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm also one of the executive directors of Game to Grow. And in my private practice, I've specialized in seeing geeks and gamers in therapy. Yeah, I guess you said all the stuff about Game to Grow, so that's good.
All the stuff has been said. I am Mr. E, or Ethan Schoonover. I've just made my peace with everybody, including adults, calling me Mr. E. I work at Lake Washington Girls Middle School. I am the technology director there, and I have somehow conned my way now into this, my second year running, both running Dungeons and Dragons clubs, obviously exclusively for girls at the school, and also actually teaching a D&D class. So I have a lot of experience, and somewhat intensive experience. We ended up playing D&D like 3 or 4 times a week with the students there. A lot of experience running games, running D&D specifically, and introducing role-playing games to the students. And we have a little announcement.
We have a little announcement. Ethan, we're working on putting together some other initiatives, and Ethan is going to be joining the Game to Grow team. So Ethan's going to be a part of Game to Grow. And especially although this is still, guys, this is hush hush. But we're working on developing, Game to Grow has been really focused on therapeutic skills through role-playing games. But what we really want to do is we want to also start developing more community outreach and more community development ideas about how role-playing games bring us together. And Ethan's already been doing a lot of that work through the school and through the work that he's been doing, and now he's going to be helping us really develop something that can reach out way beyond, hopefully beyond the Seattle area, and hopefully into programs we can develop to help bring communities together using role-playing games across the world.
And we'll talk more about how you can join in on that effort later on at the end of the presentation. So stick around.
We'll need your help.
Yeah.
It's going to take a lot.
Oh boy, will we need your help. So roughly, we're going to break this presentation into 4 sections. How's my audio, by the way? Just tell me right now. Is it too loud or is it okay? All right. I'm a loud guy. I'm a loud talker. I know it. I accept this about myself. We're going to break this into 4 sections. Choosing the game, introducing the game, modifying the game, and running the game. And we will then be leaving time at the end for questions. So if you have questions, be thinking about them as we go through. Hopefully we're going to try to answer a lot of the ones you might have. But let's start with choosing the game. And this shot is actually the students at my school. We actually got a huge load of books that were donated to us by Grant Ellis, and they were just kind of pouring through them. And most of these are actually D&D, not all though. I thought it was a nice representative shot. So let's talk a little bit about selecting the game.
How many of you play Dungeons and Dragons? How many of you play other games besides Dungeons and Dragons?
Other role-playing.
Yes. There's so many games out there, and so when you're thinking about wanting to introduce a game to kids, there's sort of this idea that you have to pick Dungeons and Dragons because that's the sort of flagship game, but there's a lot of other games out there also. So when you're thinking about the right game for your kids, there's a lot of things you're going to want to think about, both in terms of their developmental level, like what the requirement is about reading, maybe the writing components. There's lots of games that have different levels of accessibility that Dungeons and Dragons may not be the right game, even though that's the game that you might have grown up playing, and you might love that game so much. This is sort of like a golden age of role-playing games. There's so many games out there now, and there's so many games that might be the right games for the kids you want to play with. In our groups, we play Dungeons and Dragons, but we modify the rules a lot, and we'll get to a little bit about that later. But we have experimented with some other games as well, because the right game is the right game, even though it's not the game you might have grown up playing. So let's talk about a couple of other games that are out there that are for kids that you might be able to play. So there's a game by Monty Cook Games called No Thank You Evil, which is a fantastic game for younger kids. There's a really active Facebook community about running the game, and they have stories of kids as young as 4 playing No Thank You Evil. It's a very simple rule set with a single D6 dice roll with a very overt, very clear success criteria, and it's got tokens, so it's very tactile, which is really nice. And we can go a little bit more into like the needs of the physicality of the game later on. But No Thank You Evil is a fantastic game for younger kids that we've played with in some of our younger kids groups around the 7 and 8-year-old range, and it's been really easy to pick up and super simple.
One of the cool things about No Thank You Evil is that the way the system is designed, you can really play anything. You can be an astronaut or a pirate or a robot or a fantasy elf, or there's many options, and there's many different ways to go about it. And the artwork is very kid accessible and kid friendly in a way where it's both encouraging and really comprehensible by young audiences. So we've found it to be really accessible, and we have used it for some of our younger kids groups as well.
And that's a fantastic also like introduction to role-playing games, because once again, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but starting off with the right game means starting off with something that's really simple, that teaches like the structure of here's what it looks like to have a game master, here's what it looks like to have a character sheet, and then once you build that sort of skill set, you can then transition into a more challenging, more complicated game once you understand those themes, which is pretty nice too. There's another game that we have not actually played yet, but we're really excited about playing called Pugmire. Raise your hand if you've heard of Pugmire. So you guys raising your hand already know this, but it's a modification, I think it's an open gaming license game where you're playing as like sort of humanoid dogs. And we've know the Bodana group, who is located here in Philly, here in Pennsylvania, they've used the game with kids. It's very exciting to be a dog. A lot of our players actually want to be dogs anyway. So imagine a whole role-playing game where everyone is dogs. It's pretty fantastic.
One of the fun parts about Pugmire is the premise is that they're dogs in the future after mankind has passed away, and the dogs all have like statues of people as the masters. That they like worship from the times long past where they used to worship the masters.
It's so sad, isn't it?
It's super sad.
Every time I hear them describe this, I think, this is just tragic. Let's play, kids.
But it also has a sort of simplified rule set. It's a little bit more approachable. It's great for a younger audience, both because of the setting and the ideas that they're presenting, but also because the rule sets are a little more approachable than like straight 5th edition. Would you talk a little about DCC, because you've had a lot of great...
Yeah. So I started playing D&D back in the 70s and 80s, and this was part of my motivation actually for introducing it to my students, because I wanted to give them the experience that I had growing up, which is here's a game that you can have a sense of ownership of. I took a break for really a decade and a half, a couple of decades, where I didn't play a lot of role-playing games. I was living abroad. I couldn't find a group to play with. And I got back into playing through a game called DCC, which is Dungeon Crawl Classics, and it's by Goodman Games. They have a booth here. And it's sort of I wouldn't say a stripped down version of D&D, but it's a lot like D&D the way that we used to play it, which was not sure about the rules, we're gonna make all this stuff up. And imagine if you did that, but then you actually turned it into rules. It's a little bit like what DCC is. There's a lot of wild and crazy stuff that happens, and it's super fun. And I thought maybe I will play this with my students, because I think it's It's fairly accessible. You don't have to learn a ton of rules. The character sheets are literally, you could print 4 character sheets on a letter sheet of paper. Death does happen in the game, but you don't have to play it like super stark like that. And I really sweated this one. I thought, man, it's such an easy, accessible game. They could really just like onboard right away. And then I thought, the problem is they're gonna tell their friends, or they're gonna tell somebody, yeah, I play DCC, and it's not bad, and I love indie games, but I want them to be able to walk into any bookstore and be able to say, oh yeah, see the D&D books on the shelf? That's my game. And I think that you have to factor that in. I think especially, and I did a panel about girls yesterday, but I think especially with my students who are girls, I wanted them to have a sense of ownership of it. And you guys have talked about just the popularity of D&D being a factor. I think it's a reasonable choice. And we'll talk about modifying the game a little bit and how you can maybe simplify it and approach it in a different way. But I think 5e does have that strength that it is a flexible and robust system, and it survives major surgery well. You can excise huge chunks of it, and it's still recognizably D&D.
And we absolutely cut so much out of Dungeons and Dragons, the way that we play it in our groups. We take out huge chunks of it that we think don't support the actual fun part of the game for the kids. Because some kids really like crunchy number games, and some kids like to sit around in a circle and make up stories. And if you like to sit around in a circle and make up stories, then you can take out a lot of the rules and mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons in order to just do cool stuff together. You roll dice, you make up a story. That's the whole purpose why you sit down and play the game. So we've taken out big chunks of it, and we're actually transforming that thing that we've done, the transformation of Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to use the open gaming license and release our modifications to the world with a kit we're calling Critical Core. So if you've been up to our table upstairs, we have some flyers, so make sure to come up and talk to us about that afterwards. But Critical Core is basically this stripped down version of Dungeons and Dragons that is really accessible to younger kids, but also accessible to new game masters, because we've done a lot of, we've talked to a lot of parents and therapists and doctors and things who want to play games with kids, but have never played any role-playing game before. And so that, it's really important also to make a game that's accessible to game masters. Raise your hand if you're a game master. You probably learned a lot along the way in becoming a game master, and we're trying to help people maybe not have to make as many mistakes along the way and be able to kick it right out of the box. You can learn more about that at criticalcore.org, but we've learned a lot in trying to play by the book, and then realizing which rules are really not helpful, and then just kind of taking them out and ignoring them, and then realizing that's kind of a more fun game to play anyway.
I will say, especially when we're thinking about introducing games into younger audiences, a lot of it is about the storytelling piece, and that's the piece that's often going to be most appealing. That's the piece that's going to be most interesting to younger audiences, and the most different from just playing a board game or playing any other kind of game. And there's a lot of ways to introduce that sort of storytelling element in, even if you're finding that you really want to play Dungeons and Dragons and the rule set's just a little too hard for them to understand. There's actually a lot of storytelling board and card games that are great introductions into, we're going to collaboratively tell a story together. Rory's Story Cubes is a great example of that, if anybody's familiar with Story Cubes. They're really fun. They just have a bunch of pictures on them. You roll the dice, and then you basically come up with a story based on the little images that are on the dice that you roll. Or another great game is Once Upon a Time, which is a card-based game where you are, they just have images and text on them that'll say something like, there's a grandmother or there's a well, and you use those as a guide for taking turns telling story within the game structure itself. So learning how to be collaborative in that storytelling space, as well as learning sort of the asymmetric style of Dungeons and Dragons or a tabletop RPG like that, where there's one person who describes the story and then other people who sort of respond to it. Mysterium is another game that sort of teaches an asymmetric style while still having enough rules to give you some structure and some guidance on what it is that you're supposed to do. So there's a lot of games out there that can help introduce you into some of the concepts without jumping right into role-playing games if you're feeling like that hurdle is too high.
How many of you play games with, or are interested in playing games with, kids who are, say, under 9 years old? Wow, awesome.
How about under 6? Under 4? All right.
Cool.
That's brave.
So I want to just mention how I approach that with my own children. And this is something that I think a lot of us and a lot of you in the audience probably already do, but I'd like to just state it publicly as sort of a prototype system. And that is the game of all role-playing games, and it's the story game. Story game evolves directly out of reading stories to your children. Quite often with my own kids, we would, there we go. We're choosing the game. With my own kids, we would do things like, in the car or at home, we would just make up a story, right? And I would just tell it to them. They're like, Dad, tell me a story. And that turns into the story where you start asking them questions, right? So it's now it's a story plus asking questions. And it usually goes something like this. There are two children, and they are walking through the forest. And coincidentally, they have your names. and it's very.
What are the chances?
I know. We used to play one too, where later on they go into the shadow world and their names are backwards. I mean, it gets crazy. So you start off and you see a squirrel. The squirrel runs by, and the squirrel's wearing a hat. And you see the squirrel with a little hat, and it's looking at a pocket watch. You may have read this story before. I steal with abandon. The squirrel dives into a pile of leaves, and then suddenly the wind blows leaves away and it's gone. What do you do? I mean, that's it for the next 3 hours of your life. I'm going to warn you. And it's just question and response. Later on, you can start to add in simple dice rolls, right? So you can have them roll a d6 and find out, are you able to talk to this tree? Or are you able to discover some secret door? And, with you want to fudge the rolls a little bit, right? So, but just getting them used to rolling things. And that turns into, I think, naturally, the idea of introducing the game.
So we have a lot of styles. We play with many kids who come to our groups who've never played an RPG before. And one of our biggest goals is we want to make sure that they have a really fun time the very first day when they first come into the group. So with that in mind, there's some parts that I absolutely love about RPGs. I love making characters. I love creating some backstory, creating some personality to my character. But all of that is only really meaningful if you've ever played an RPG before. So if you've never played an RPG before, none of that really means a lot. So we use pre-made characters in our groups to hand to our players, but we do give them some choice. So we have a series of pre-made characters, and then we ask them questions like, when you imagine your character in this fantasy world, looks like maybe a lot like Lord of the Rings, where there's magic and bows and arrows and swords and armor. When you imagine you're playing a character in that world, are you standing up at the front line with maybe heavy armor or a big sword or a big hammer? Or are you standing in the back with spells and magic or a bow and arrow? And we use that kind of questioning and often sort of pick one of these two questions to help narrow down what kind of character they want to play. And eventually they say I want to stand in the back, and I'll go, awesome, do you want to cast magic spells, or do you want to use a bow and arrow? And they'll say, I want to use a bow and arrow. And I was like, great, here is the archer character that we have made. You now have a character.
And if they can't make a decision, if they're like, I want to be everything, we're like, cool, you're the bard.
Yeah, the jack of all trades. Yeah. So and once we hand them their character, we still want them to make decisions. We still want them to dive into customizing that character. But the really important piece of that customization is more personality, how they describe the character. So then we give them the choices and we say stuff like, we're going to name your character. Let's name your character together. Or we're going to come up with a backstory. Is your character from a big city or a small town? What is the big city or small town well known for? Giving them some opportunity to create some input into that backstory. One of my favorite questions that we almost always end that with is, at some point your character became an adventurer. Why did they leave their big city or small town to become an adventurer? And those questions give this lean-to of giving them the opportunity to sort of build that character background. So they're still making choices and still getting a chance to let that character be something they have designed. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's great. Sorry, I was transfixed.
I was actually, that does remind me, I did want to say, in addition to a lot of that process, We also like to really make sure that new players are not overwhelmed by the stuff that's on their character sheet. So when we do hand the character sheet over to them, it's a 5th edition character sheet. There's a lot of information on there, and we basically say ignore everything that's on this character sheet. And then what we do is we teach them all the pieces of that character sheet gradually as they come up. So when it's time for them to roll an attack, we go, great, now we're going to roll an attack. Find your 20-sided die. Let's figure out which die is the 20-sided die. Have them hold it up. Awesome, just roll that die a couple of times. Now we're going to have you roll an attack. An attack uses a 20-sided die, and then you're going to add this bonus right here. So go ahead and add those numbers together. We really walk them through that process, but we don't really do it until it comes time for it to be meaningful to them.
And when we're getting started, we always I think a lot of game masters do this, but they're like, cool, here are all your characters. You find yourself in a large town. What do you want to do? And a brand new player is like, I don't know, burn something down? Steal? I want to steal something, I guess? I don't know. So it's really useful to like start them off with a hook, some sort of adventure hook, like an NPC or something that they really like, that they can like really invite them into the game.
So a common hook that we use for a lot of our very early groups. Many of our players struggle with connecting with social skills. They are often socially isolated. They really struggle being able to work collaboratively or cooperatively with other people at the table. And when you have a brand new group of 4 players, maybe who are kids, they're very young, and they are sitting down with a bunch of strangers, it can be really difficult to build that early connection. So we do a classic tavern start with those players. I know it's cliche. They're new to the game. They don't know the cliches yet. So we do a classic tavern start. And the way that it works is that they all come into the tavern one at a time as their characters. And when they sit down in the tavern, they meet Seamus. And Seamus is the most friendly guy. He comes by and he says, what can I get you? Can I get you some soup?
So we have taverns, but we don't have alcohol in our games.
Yeah.
Because one thing that we've noticed, and we'll get to this a little bit more with modifying the game, but a lot of kids, especially middle school and high school, are like, I'm going to drink. Do they have vodka? And then you're like, well, we're not going to spend the rest of the day like exploring drinking, so that you can go home and their parents are like, what'd you do in group today? Well, we drank a lot. Yeah. And then we had such mirth and revelry with drinking. So we just don't have alcohol in our game, so every tavern they go into is a soup tavern, where everybody drinks soup from mugs.
Big, frothy, golden soups of mugs. Tankards of mugs. Tankards of soup? Whoa. It has been a long time.
Sunday.
Little mugs inside of it. Little mugs. Yeah. I want some mug soup.
It's mugs all the way down.
So they come in.
Tell us about Seamus.
They come in.
Surely nothing bad could
drinking their
happen.
mugs of some mug soup. They come in and they talk to Seamus. And Seamus is just a super friendly guy. He says, oh man, it's super friendly. Oh, God. Okay. He says, Seamus says, wow, you guys are you have an amazing sword. You're such a beautiful dwarven beard. Seamus compliments them on whatever they have. And no matter what they ask for, whatever kind of soup they want to ask for, Seamus has it.
Dragon breath soup.
They have dragon breath soup. They have fire soup. Seamus has crazy soups like potato leek soup. And Seamus will bring whatever soup. So when the Seamus goes like, what kind of soup can I get you? That's a nice sword. You must have been on the road for a long time. And then the player says like, I want nothing. And Seamus goes, nothing soup. It's one of my favorites. It's so light and airy. You can eat so much of it. And Seamus he'll go into the back room. He'll bring back out the soup. You get a chance to like really eat the soup, and all the players come in. They get to have that same kind of interaction and fun and connection with Seamus. And then all of a sudden, the tavern comes under attack, and a man in black armor bursts through the wall, and he takes out a dagger and kills Seamus.
That's the reaction you're looking for.
And that's the right reaction. That moment. Whatever those players had, whatever maybe conflicts were coming up or little pieces of things where they were really kind of grinding against each other, it's all gone. They now all want to kill the man in black armor. And they're all bound together now in this experience that they had, that they liked Seamus, and this guy took Seamus away from them. Now, we adjust the game a lot for different ages. Seamus doesn't always die. Sometimes Seamus gets stabbed, and then he's like infected with a deep curse, and the players need to go after a flower in order to cure Seamus. We've had groups cure him, but bind his soul. They couldn't cure his body, so they bind his soul to a mundane object. We had a group kill him, and he was going to die, and the group wanted to save him, and so they tried to cast a spell to save him, but the spell went wrong, and so all they could save was his head. So they spent the rest of the campaign with Seamus's head in a bag around with them, and Seamus would speak up occasionally and be like, "Man, I miss eating soup." And became like an integrated part of their plot line.
Not for 7-year-olds.
Not for that's true, slightly older.
Those are teenagers.
Yeah.
But either way, that moment where Seamus gets injured, where Seamus maybe dies, bonds them together, and now you have a hook. Now you have something to really play with motivation and get your players moving in a direction. Rather than just saying, like, here's a place for you to go explore.
And so now that all the players are like so jazzed about, they don't care about burning down buildings and stealing things anymore. All they care about is like getting revenge for Seamus's attack. And so it just so happens that Seamus is actually secretly part of a secret society of good guys. So Seamus in his last like dying breath goes, "There's a secret door in the basement. Find the magic item before the man in black." And then, of course, they want to go to the basement, and then it's a little tutorial. Now that you're in this room, here's how you look for secret doors. And so here's a little tutorial where we show them how to make investigation checks and how to search. And then they find the secret door. And then basically the next thing that happens is a series of rooms protecting this magic item. And each one is a different sort of Dungeons and Dragons style encounter. So it's like your first room you go into, there's like maybe a large group of spiders. Now we're going to teach combat. Cool, now there's spiders, clearly bad guys. They're gonna kill you and eat you and hang you from the ceiling. There's not a lot of moral conundrum there. So it's really useful, like, to sort of, we'll get some more of that in modifying the game, but it's really useful to have, like, no questions asked. You're not gonna tame the spiders, there's spiders. Anyway, so then we teach combat, and then after you get past the spiders, there's maybe like a room that has a pit, and how do you get across the pit? And now we're gonna talk about some more out-of-the-box thinking. And then we have an NPC, there's a ghost down there who won't tell you the secret password to get out of this room until you tell him a joke. And then we sort of get some of the like non-rules stuff, sort of introducing like this is what it looks like to just interact with an NPC. You're not going to roll persuasion on this guy. You're going to have to talk to him. So we're teaching that one room at a time until eventually we get to sort of the big boss battle where they might fight the henchmen of the man in black armor, and then they get to go out into the world. So it's really like one step at a time. You now have all these skills. You know what the important parts of your character sheet are, and then the door opens and there's a big wide world to go exploring in.
So we like the linear dungeon, but you've actually used a couple of different ways of introducing it.
So I would say that whereas you have a very structured kind of experience with Seamus and that initial lead-in, we're gonna kind of bleed into how we modify the game here a little bit. This is the first day of my first D&D club back in 2017. The girls walking in, we have a classic Moldvay cover up on the door. I'm trying to recreate the early 80s as much as possible here. And this is I would say 8 weeks later. 8 weeks later, I commissioned this art
They
from...
all turned into cartoons.
Yes, they turned into the D&D cartoon and are sucked into the world. I commissioned this from Kayla Klein. She's a great artist. And these are all their characters, now fully fleshed out, all sorts of personality. The girl roasting rocks in a frying pan over the fire is a cleric of the food gods. They're all hilarious and wonderful, and they each got one of these, and you can see here they're doing sort of embodiment of the actual poses. So they're a great group, but I want to talk a little bit about what happened between day one and then 8 weeks later. They didn't achieve level 1. So this is something that I took. We're kind of bleeding into modifying the game a little bit. We're also calling back to choosing the game. I took something from DCC, from my experience in DCC, which is the concept of level 0. Now, level 0, for those of you who are true old school D&D players, was around during primarily 2nd edition in some of the modules, and I see some heads nodding. So it's not a completely foreign D&D concept, but it's kind of fallen by the wayside. The idea is you're not level 1. Very easy. And so I told the girls, you have like negative experience points. You're essentially student debt. And you now need to go out into the world. And we start off, you're all villagers. And I have them, I give them each a blank character sheet. And I've done this different ways. So you guys actually kind of have pre-gens. I wanted them to choose like a race. I wanted them to choose a class eventually, but not right away. We rolled stats. With my first group, I rolled 3d6. In order, you take what you get.
Oh man, that's harsh.
That's
so
tell you
harsh.
what, I love it. I still love it. I've kind of gone back to now 4d6 drop 1, the standard, or using the matrix of standard values. But there's something to be said for doing 3d6 in order, because you get crazy numbers, you get some low stats, and they have to kind of shoot, like just deal with it. And I honestly, like, I don't really keep them, I don't force them to role play to their stats either. They can kind of do what they want. Anyhow, so we've got the stats then. We've got a name for your character, and maybe they're thinking about the appearance. And boy, do the girls in my school love to think about the appearance of their character. Like that's their real class. My class is purple hair.
What clothes you're wearing.
Subclass in hazel eyes. Yeah, they will go into a lot of detail about that for me. And then I have them roll a d30. It's something else I stole from DCC, a lot of strange dice. And I look up on a table. And sometimes the table is a legitimate table, and sometimes it's one of these behind the screen tables that you have that looks just like this.
An imaginary table.
Yes. And I will give them a background, and the background will be some sort of common job that they had in the village. And the village could be that they cleaned out the stables. They were a stable hand. Could be that they were a cook's assistant. They were a librarian's assistant. Maybe they were an apprentice hunter. Those are all examples from this first group. And what I was not prepared for is how much they loved those backgrounds. They really were like, okay, I'm an apprentice hunter. I've got leaves in my hair. I've got a bow. My parents died in a tragic fire. They're just they're going for it, right? That's all they needed, was just that little platform to build personality and story around. And they don't have a class. Essentially, they're all fighters right now. And they are in their village, and I have them maybe develop a little bit of relationship. Like, are you guys related? Do you know each other? Do you not know each other? Are you cousins? Are you in speaking terms? What's going on with your lives? And they come up with a little bit of backstory and relationship. And then trouble comes to town, right? You always want trouble to come to town real quick. There's a man, he stumbles into town, wounded in the side. Quick, take this map. They're coming. They're just over the hill. And you hear hunting horns in the distance, and these girls are now panicked. They're just like sheer terror. And he's like, you must escape. Get out of the village quickly. And if they're not motivated at that point, then maybe the village elders come and they're like, you have to leave. Quick, take our book of knowledge and flee the village, what have you. And then they take off. So they haven't seen what's coming, but they've heard the hunting horns. And that's really what you want, because they're going to hear those hunting horns for the rest of the next several sessions. And that further pushes them into the forest. And then along the way, what's happening, of course, is that they are getting experiences much like the tutorial dungeon, and they do eventually end up going into catacombs. And at the end of all that, so they've killed some monsters, they've seen some traps, they've had some moral quandaries, which we can talk about later. After all of that, they get to the Hall of Doors. And the Hall of Doors it's this magical hallway, and it has 1,000, and as I describe it, I say you walk into this hall and you see 1,000 doors. And the girls in my group thought I said 1,000 dwarves, and so to this day, they will talk with fond recollection of the 1,000 dwarves that they saw in this hall. But I explained that they have to choose a door, and that door will be their class. It'll be like their role in life, and they transform when they go through the door, and they get new abilities and new knowledge, and that is how they become magic users and fighters and such. So that leads us into really modifying the game. Let's talk a little bit more about this.
So like Adam said, we change huge portions of the game. The real important part of this is that you want to keep the parts of the game that continue to make the game fun and get rid of the parts of the game that get in the way of that fun. The designers, even Dungeons and Dragons is a reasonably crunchy game. Maybe not as crunchy as Pathfinder. Does everybody know what crunchy means? Okay. Maybe not as crunchy as Pathfinder or 3.5, but it's still 5th edition is still a pretty crunchy game. But it's so adaptable to taking out whole chunks or taking out pieces that you don't want, or even putting in other pieces that you think would be especially interesting or especially engaging for the game. Having players make background relationships with each other a la Apocalypse World. Or incorporating extra skill bonuses in the same way that 13th Age does. I encourage you to learn about other skill systems and learn about other RPG systems and steal from them like crazy for your games. They all bring really brilliant ideas and really brilliant concepts that you can bring to bear with your RPG system. If it's going to add to the fun experience, that's a big part of what you want.
And the fun part for a lot of kids is doing crazy, amazing things. Like they watch cartoons and superheroes, just do crazy things. So we give out lots of inspiration and say yes to almost everything. It's important to teach boundaries and to teach there are limits to what's possible, but you can do that while also being pretty amazing and pretty awesome. So we give out so much inspiration, largely because we're reinforcing pro-social behaviors, but we're also giving out lots of inspiration because we ultimately want the kids to be successful. There's sort of a trend in gaming where a lot of game masters are take on an adversarial role, where it's I'm going to see if you can get past my challenges. But that's not the right approach to play with kids, because you're wanting to support them. You're wanting to help them get over those challenges. You want them to be successful. So whenever we modify or kind of have those invisible tables or those invisible numbers behind the screen, more often than not, we're actually doing that to help them, not to hurt them. Because we want their characters to overcome challenges. We want them to feel awesome and powerful. So we oftentimes will fudge things in the kids' benefit. And I hope they're not watching this on YouTube later.
Yeah. So Adam, maybe you can also mention, one of the things that I've heard you describe doing is, in Game to Grow, both of you talk about embodiment. I've also done some embodiment work with the girls. And I feel and actually before we get to embodiment, maybe you can talk very briefly about you have a great phrase, which is hand them a spoon, hand them a fork.
Oh yeah.
So a lot of kids have a hard time making decisions. So, especially in an open sandbox world, where if they're used to playing games, especially if they grew up playing games like Candyland, where you just go, bzzz.
There are no decisions in Candyland after you pick the color of your character.
Pick a card, I guess, is Candyland. But anyway, there's spinning things. You roll a die and you move that number of spaces. That's the whole game. It's all of a sudden there's an infinite palette of choices. So that can be kind of overwhelming if you've never played a game like this before. So one of the things strategies we found to be really helpful is to do what we call offering a fork, which earlier Adam described when helping a player make up a backstory. The question is, do you come from a big city or a small town? So we've given two choices. We don't say, where are you from? I don't know. But if we can say big city or small town, then they have choices. If we say something like, do you guys want to climb over the wall or do you guys want to sneak past the guard? Then we've sort of limited the selection there and then given them some options. Where if you say, how do you want to get into the castle, that might be a little bit, produce an anxiety response if there's too many choices there. But if you can provide that sort of forking pathway, then it really helps support them in now that we've chosen how to get over the wall. Now we have to think about, do we climb, do we throw a rope, do we do that kind of thing? But it's much more linear. So that's a very valuable skill to just have in your back pocket. If you see players not sure what to do, you can help them by giving them some limited choices. But even on top of that, you can also do what we call spoon feeding them, where if they really are struggling, you're like, how do you want to sneak past the guard? If they're not sure what to do, then do you want to roll a stealth check to see if you can sneak past the guard? Then it's really setting it up for them. And once again, I'm going to roll for the perception for that guard. He's looking the other way.
He has his helmet on backwards.
You guys sneak right past him. He's asleep. Wow. And like that's like makes the kids feel successful. It really reinforces the structure of the game, so that later on, once they understand a little bit more about it, they can really they can do a lot more of that out of the box thinking without having to worry about the anxiety response of making the right choice.
But I will say, making choices is always better than talking to them. There's like a term that you learned in education that's talking is better than listening, and
moving is better than sitting.
Moving is better than
so
sitting.
My background is in drama therapy, and I was an educator for several years, and I was a drama educator for several years, and I bring a lot of that flavor into the way that I game master, because I used to teach kids movement, embodiment, role play. So now my Dungeons and Dragons experiences are very similar to that. I do a lot of embodiment. I ask the players to sit at the table like they're players, or sit at the table like they're characters, or get up and move around the room sometimes like they're characters. One case in particular, a lot of our kids have some degree of like social challenges, and one of these particular players was he had very closed off body language, and so he would do a lot of sitting like with his whole body curled up, and he would speak very quietly. And he wasn't manifesting a lot of the engagement, but he had chosen to play a dwarf barbarian. So that's my access point. I know that this is something that this player wants to play with. So I had him, this player who had very closed off body language, sit at the table like his character would sit at the table. And then in the game, I had them actually, the characters had to infiltrate a fancy dinner party, because that's the kind of game that I play. They had to find some information about a corrupt magistrate or something who happened to be having a gala. But you need to find your way into the gala, and you can't kill your way into the gala because you need to find some information. You can't just go attack it. So once again, there was a guard at the door who was like, "Are you guys visiting from a foreign kingdom? And you're going through the royal entrance?" And they were like, yes. Like, oh, okay, you must be a king from a foreign land. And then that became the thing. So then they were socially challenged teenagers pretending to be dwarf barbarians, pretending to be visiting royalty. So we had, it goes deep. And so then I had them pretend to be their characters, pretending to be royalty at the table as if they were sitting at the fancy dinner party. So my player, who was before really wrapped up like this, I had him sit at the table with his legs spread out, and he would hammer his hands on the table, and that was the way for him to, like, all of a sudden he's engaged way more than he's ever been before. And it was because I gave his character an opportunity, him as a player, to play out his character. I gave him the opportunity to, like, take up space and move the way that his character would move. And then when I talk to him in character, I make him talk back to me in character. And then I'm like, oh, I see that you're taking up lots of space because you're the king. I think I should take up space too, Your Majesty. And then the two of us could sit at the table, and I'm playing all the NPCs who think he's a king. So when he's like grabbing bread from the waiters walking by, my NPCs are like, I should also grab the bread because that's what the king does. That was what I was taught when I was in manners school.
Copy the king.
Copy the king. Do what the king does. So it's this opportunity for the play to be bigger than just the game, right? So now this person is getting a chance to embody. Their engagement is much higher, and they remembered that. That was a thing that we could refer back to for session after session after session. Was this like opportunity to sit at the table big?
Can I ask you to briefly address some of the tools? So I'll give you an example of borrowing from another game, and maybe we can riff off that a little bit. I recently had a girl join our group midway through a campaign, and she turned out to have a little bit of anxiety about some of the scarier stuff in the session. There were some dead bodies that we encountered, and the other girls were kind of okay with it. I was a little iffy about it anyhow, and so when I sensed that she was anxious, I was like, I was talking to her about it, and one of the other girls spoke up and she said, "Hey, I play this game called No Thank You Evil," and which we've mentioned. And in that game, you can say "No Thank You Evil" if things are getting too scary. And why don't you use that phrase? And you can say those words, and then we will know that you are not feeling comfortable. So these are my girls talking to each other, problem solving, and I'm like, I'll just leave the room, okay?
They got it.
But that was great, and we encouraged, we used that, and it's a safe space. Now she felt much safer because she had a tool. So what tools do you guys use in your table for a similar purpose?
So this is a pretty important concept, because as you're playing with kids, modifying content is a pretty important part of the game. A lot of times with our players, we will purposefully introduce them into killing monsters with young players that are, like we said before, don't have any kind of moral conundrum built into it. You're killing skeletons or constructs or sort of mutant-sized spiders. Those are easy to grasp. These are clearly bad guys and they're clearly monsters. But there's a lot of stuff that you can kind of add into the game as tools for the players to be available that we really like to do. And some of this we do. Is everybody familiar with the term Session Zero? So Session Zero is often referred to before you start playing the game, before you have your very first sit down. We're gonna start diving into our game. You sometimes have what's called a Session Zero, and a Session Zero is we're gonna outline some of the rules to the game or the kind of game that we want to play, and outline for ourselves, for everybody at the table, so we can communicate about what is this game gonna be. For our players, obviously, we don't get to have a Session Zero because we want them to jump in and start playing right away. But we can still introduce a lot of these things that we might have introduced in a Session Zero throughout the game in much the same way that your girls did for No Thank You Evil. So I guess one of them, I'll speak briefly about the Fade to Black. So when it comes up in the game that somebody's being tortured or there's a scene that seems inappropriate for the audience. Maybe there's a sex scene or something along those lines. And you're like, I don't really want to play out this scene. Or it's clear that some of the players at the table are uncomfortable. One great tool for that is Fade to Black. The way Fade to Black works is that imagine a movie scene where somebody goes like, all right, we're going to get the information out of him. And then he turns around, there's a guy strapped to the chair, and he's like, oh no! And then rather than play out the whole torture scene, they just fade to black. And then it comes back up, the scene comes back up, and then they go like, well, we got that information. Whew, good thing that we did that. So you don't play out the torture scene, you just say, great, this torture happened, now you have this information. Fade to Black's a great tool because you can do it from any player. It doesn't have to be the dungeon master or the game master that does the Fade to Black. Any player can say, this is making me uncomfortable, I want to fade to black and skip ahead to what happens after this. And that can be just a super useful tool of saying, great, let's skip forward and move on with the important parts of our game and the fun parts of our game.
And that's a great way to respect player agency, because the players still get to have their characters do what they want to do. Sometimes when you get to like kind of messy stuff like torture, sometimes that might come up in your session zero of like, here's the stuff we don't want in the game. And torture is a very easy thing to say, I don't want to have in the game. Or slavery is a thing that I don't want to have in the game. Lots of things like that might be triggering in some way or another. You might just not have in the game. But once it does come up, there are ways that you can talk about it. Like a fade to black as a preset thing you can do is really valuable. But also, if it's something that comes up that you don't want to happen in the game, having another established thing, like in one of my groups, they're like 15, 16, so they're on the age where, you know, something like wanting to torture a rival guard might be an instinct that they might want to have. But also, like, I'm really trying to reinforce some pro-social behaviors, and torture is not one of those things.
Torture, not pro-social.
So there's your takeaway. I have a thing that we've set up where I just say new choice. And if I say new choice, it doesn't mean that there's any punishment. I'm not in any way judging you. It's just an opportunity to try something new. So I'll even do that if they're like kind of repeating the same tactic a lot. I'll just say new choice. Like you've tried that. You've tried that way of overcoming every obstacle. You've tried threatening every guy. You try to get to intimidation. Make a new choice. Try something different. And having that framework early on of new choice is really useful when I have a player who's playing a demon who was ripped from their body and put into a small stone that is now carried around by an unseen servant. But their backstory is like they're an evil demon lord who like wants to find the person who ripped their soul from their body and then reverse the spell. And I was like, you can only play this character if you go on a journey of redemption. If you, in wandering the earth as a stone carried by an unseen servant, you have a redemptive story where you discover, you know, the true meaning of Christmas. I got some buy-in from that, but they're still like, I want to torture everyone that I see and rip their teeth. New choice. I want to torture. New choice. I want to convince the world that I'm powerful. Great. So there's ways you can just kind of reinforce those patterns of behavior and then disincentivize those patterns of behavior also.
Another really...
I'll just mention that we're almost 10 minutes out from the end, and if we want to leave space... go ahead and
are there questions? Do you guys have questions? Cool. Let's start getting some lineup for questions, and if there are no further questions, I'll just tell more stories, because that's what I'll do.
Oh yeah, we have no shortage of stories.
Yeah.
So, I just started running a group with my teenage son and some of his friends, and what I found is I'm having a lot of players get distracted. So I've got 2 players in the cave getting their butts kicked. Other 3 are outside trying to catch squirrels. How do I get the...
Like literally outside or outside in the game?
Outside the cave.
Okay.
Okay, outside the cave.
Yeah. It might be the other way. We should ask.
Table rules are great. So if you establish table rules early on, like, we don't split the party. That's a table rule. Then when they want to split the party, like, how are we going to do that without splitting the party? We've established this table rule is a great way to do it. There's other ways you can encourage, like, being present, and sometimes that's like giving out inspiration if you're ready on your turn and initiative. There's like really ways to very quickly reinforce that, and the game moves along and is more fun if people are present. So then the more you can like appreciate that and show them that, that's really reinforcing for them.
There's also a couple of really easy tips to when one player wants to go off and do their own thing, to let that be a thing that happened and then bring them immediately back. So if they say, oh, I see a squirrel, I go chasing the squirrel, you go, awesome, you went and you caught the squirrel, and now you're back at the cave with everybody else. We're just going to fast forward through that, you did that, good job, now we're back at the cave.
Roll a d4, that's how many squirrels you got.
have that many squirrels now. Or you can use it as a way to bring the whole party back together. Yes, you start chasing the squirrels and you notice all the squirrels start running into the cave. It looks like one of the monsters in the cave has a magic whistle that attracts squirrels. You can use the focus of their attention to tie back into the storyline of what you're creating.
Yeah, and I've had the girls split. I had this group of 8 girls, and they split out into 3 sections, and it was a little nightmarish, but it was also the best time that we had in that whole game. And I just spoke very frankly to them at one point. I said, this has been awesome, and we've all loved it, but I'm also hoping to bring you guys back together. And they were cool with that. They were like, it was a little bit of metagaming, but they were on board with it, and they were like, yeah, let's get back together. So. There might be an opportunity to speak, just metagame a little bit about it.
Yeah, actually, to the metagame idea, you can bring it out where you can say let it happen one time, and as you're like focusing on the squirrel stuff that's happening, and the 2 people in the cave are like, when's it my turn? And you're like, oh, so this is a good time to reflect on the idea that when we split up the party, it slows the game down a lot. Yeah. And now all of a sudden, like, it's going to take us a really long time to get through everything. I really encourage you not to split the party in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone behind me? Hi, so I'm both a therapist and completely obsessed with D&D. I've seen some of what you guys have done and what the Bodhana group's doing, and was interested in getting into that a little bit, therapeutic role-playing. So from both the business and the therapy perspective, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you were starting out?
We could do a whole panel about that.
Yeah.
We've learned a whole lot. So if you're trying to convince somebody else that they should take their kids to play D&D for benefits, the short answer is speak the language that they want to hear. Like, if you're talking to teachers, you're gonna tell why D&D is awesome with, like, you want your kids to be able to have frustration tolerance so they don't get pulled out of class for being disruptive. Like, D&D can help teach that. Or if you're talking to a therapist and the therapist has a kid who's very socially isolated, imagine your kid wanting to be around other kids. Like, that D&D can provide that. That's the short answer. Is we learned that early on. Like, people don't care that you're playing 5th edition, that you like 5th edition more than Pathfinder. They don't care about that. They don't care about any of the modifications we make to the game. They care about the outcomes that come from it. Yeah. We can talk to you more about this at length, though.
Yeah.
I'll just add to that very, very briefly. If any of you this is riffing off that, if you're pitching to a school or you're pitching the idea of a group like this, one of the best things that you can say, and I didn't say it early on and I should have, is this is time without screens and it's face-to-face. And you can kind of stop there and people will be on board.
Yeah. And it's fun, and they're going to want to come back time after time. They're going to always want to come back to this.
Follow up with us on Twitter, and we have some more information coming up in a moment. You can sign up for some mailing lists and stuff, and we'll give as much information as possible.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, I was GMing for a group of teenagers, and one problem that I ran into very quickly was that there was a sort of range of level of RPG interest that was very wide. So I had the kid who, when he found out we were going to be playing, went and like read 3 rule books before we ever got as far as like session 0. And I had people on the other end of that spectrum who wanted to play and were enjoying themselves, but were not like RPG nerd in the same way. And I mean, that happens with adults too, but I felt like this was a really wide gap that was hard to manage. I wonder if you have any thoughts.
So, excitement is contagious if you give it the right tools to be so. When we have one player who's really well versed with the rules, who's really knowledgeable about things, and then other players who've never played before, we want to empower the player who has all that knowledge to share their excitement with the other players at the table. So we will do things like, oh, I'm so glad that you know all of that. I'm so glad that you are so skilled with the game. Would you help us teach the game to these other players? Would you help show them where things are? And when things come up in the game and we go, all right, it's time to roll an attack roll. And the one player's like, awesome, I rolled the attack roll. I rolled my D20 and my D8 together so that I could just go ahead and do them together. I had advantage, so I had 2 D20s. So I rolled it all. And they're like ready to go. And then we can say, I'm so glad you're so prepared. Would you help them find where their attack bonus is? Because that would be really helpful. Would you help them figure out which die is the D8 so that they can roll their damage as well? And empowering that player really helps them to feel like now they're a part of the group and helping it be more successful.
Yeah, and one of the things I did was have the girls do group research projects where they would break into small teams and they would research things like the races and then give brief presentations. They would do that over the course of like an hour or hour and a half. So they'd have to do little visual aids. This is what an elf looks like compared to everybody else, and this is how tall they are. And they loved it. They all learned stuff, and it's a great way of both getting them involved personally and also then explaining actual information to the group.
How many of them played the race?
Oh yeah, we'd never had any gnomes played before in the group, and then once the girls did this presentation on how amazing gnomes are, and they're so awesome and tiny and fun, then we had like a whole raft of gnomes, like a literal raft. So, yeah,
That's awesome.
Hi, I'm a teen librarian, so I have the challenge of not always having immediate access to the kids who may or may not be interested. So I have just questions about like, what do you do if someone's showing up one week, doesn't show up next week? What happens if someone brings a friend? What is a recommended session length? How many people should I cap it at? Like,
Those are all great questions.
nitty gritty
let's see.
stuff.
Please communicate with me on Twitter, by the way, and I will tell you all of my deep thoughts about this.
Let's see. So our sessions are an hour and a half long. We also do a check-in and a checkout. We started actually doing longer sessions at the beginning and found that they were too long. Even 2 hours, especially with younger kids, turned into too long of a time period to like sit down and really be focused at the game. And we wanted to end the session, and we recommend this for any dungeon master, but definitely working with younger kids. End the session before it stops being fun. The thing that you're most likely to remember from the experience is the very last part of the experience that you have. So if you end the session at the cliffhanger, ready to like dive in and fight the next bad guy or the big boss or something along those lines, you're gonna really remember that and be really excited to come back to the next session. And that's way, way better than going like, awesome, you beat the big bad guy, I guess we're done. Okay, bye. Whereas you open the door and you see a massive spider with mandibles dripping with acid in front of you, and that's where we're going to end for today. It really creates that extra engagement. So I always recommend ending before it stops being fun. Yeah.
We have 4 players per game master. We're working with a sensitive population, so it's really useful to make sure everybody shines. We think like 6 would be the maximum number you'd want to have. I don't know, Ethan,
I've run with 8, yeah. I have 26 now. Let's talk about that later online. And a lot of variance in terms of some variance, I should say, like the percentage, maybe 5% that show up or don't show up based on their schedule. And I've had to adapt to that. I have very specific tools that I use now to address that. And we're out of time, I think, but I'm happy to share that online. Okay. So thank you for your question, by the way. That's a super big one, and we'll have a whole panel on that, evidently.
Yeah.
At Game to Grow, at Sparks for Sharks, at Adam Johns, and at Ethan Schoonover. If you visit gametogrow.org/PAX, there is a whole heap of links that Adam has put up online. I'll let you guess which Adam, I'm not going to say. And that includes a sign up for the new community initiative for Game to Grow. So please visit that, sign up, talk to us online, and thank you so much for coming.
And enjoy the rest of your PAX.
Okay, I just want to say that I'm getting a ceremonial Game to Grow shirt from Adam right now, and I'm really touched about this. Yeah. I think this means I've been knighted.